next author is Dr. Lacey Schmidt. She has many personalities. She runs her own company. She's the executive director for faculty development at the University of Houston. She spends when she's not at her day job, she morphs into a poet, author, adventurer, and novelist. In the latter instance, she has published 3 LesFic novels with Affinity, A Walk Away, Catch to Release, and Playing with Matches. She's also penned a number of short stories, Love's Luck and Peaches and Honey. And Lacey also has a story in the Lone Star collection entitled A Lone Star, which is our one and only sci-fi story in there. She's married, she lives in Houston. She and Laura have several furry children. Oberon is the ginger cat that's known as the tabby terrorist, and his sidekick, Sabina. And then she has 2 couch-loving dogs named Misha and Nakita.
Russian spy dogs, so if anybody needs some escape artists, I can loan them out. So I'm going to have to beg your indulgence. I want to do something very odd, not just a normal reading. I would like to read from you guys from a work in progress, which in itself isn't all that unusual, but this one makes me very nervous. It is by far the hardest thing I've ever written in my life. It's about 70% through, which means I still have a chance to fix something. So instead of you asking me questions, I'm going to finish by asking you questions. So be prepared. There's a pop quiz. And I will say one of the reasons that it's been so hard is because it has more emotional depth than anything I've probably ever written. To give you a little bit of background that's completely unnecessary, right about the time I finished my 3rd novel, Playing with Matches, which I've always written traditional, contemporary, LesFic, romance, my life started looking like a very bad country song. Part of it, our house flooded, my in-laws developed Lewy body dementia and died. We just had a whole series of things going on, so I didn't do a whole lot of writing in the 6 months right after Playing with Matches came out. So yes, this has a darker tone to it, but I will say that there are happy things that come out of that, so that's the disqualifying warning. But still, feel free to complain if it's too dark, because that's one of the things I want to know. The story is called A Badge Washed Up, and it was inspired by actually finding a badge that washed up when I was at a friend's beach house in Sanibel, Florida, and trying to trace that badge to its original owner. And I, supposed many things about what would happen if somebody different from me had found that. Somebody who didn't know as much or have as much authority to do anything about it as I've been blessed with. And from there, Janie Jones' story started coming out. So A Badge Washed Up is really about Janie who finds the badge. And I'm going to read you as much of the first chapter as I can get in until you run away or yell at me. So, Chapter 1, The Hook. Back then, only a year ago chronologically, but another life ago in every other respect, I stared at the Gulf of Mexico every day too. I stared at it from a far different angle though, from a different state altogether even. I was literally a different person. Back then I was Janie Jones, and even though that name sounds like a false identity, it was in fact my real name. I'd never ever perpetrated a crime back then. I'd seen plenty of crimes. Played the usual bit parts given to a black middle-aged woman in America, powerless bystander, witness, victim, mother of the victim. That last one was the one that completely unraveled the world of Janie Jones and spelled her doom, hook, line, and sinker. These days, my son doesn't die in any of my dreams. He's dead, but I don't dream of his death anymore. Acquiring this new small blessing took a strange confluence of miracles. I had to perpetrate that crime, and it started with my usual walk on the beach. I took those walks hoping to find myself too exhausted to dream at all, because back then my son Saul died in nearly all of my dreams. And even when he didn't die in my dreams still were nightmares of a different sort. He was alive in those dreams and so real that it hurt. Some dreams I could even smell his hair, feel the smooth skin of his forehead under my lips. My heart was a wound that never healed, harpooned to an endlessly thrashing wail of grief. I was a divorced, bitter, lonely wreck. And I walked that beach for miles and miles every day in the heat, just trying to outrun my own mind. My feet cracked. Plodding fatigue boiled my anguish down to the most basic part of life, breathing. Breathing was living. I preferred to walk after work, already half exhausted at sunset. I liked to see the sky bleed out over the Gulf of Mexico, the small death of every day. One day in August was different, though. It contained the thread that finally unraveled my beaten existence. The heat on the sand was so hot that my eyes felt scorched. I felt sorry for all the little elders of the Shore Acres Seaside Retirement Resort where I worked. Their thin old skin loved the heat, but so much sun was hard on their pale eyes. In truth, I felt sorry for the entire world. I felt sorry all the time. The beach, normally crowded with tourists and retirees of all kinds, was largely deserted thanks to weeks and weeks of red tide. My hands trembled some that day, my nerves a little overwhelmed by the noxious fumes of all the dead fish, as I bent down to pick up and poke the odds and ends that washed up on shore along with them. I found all sorts of things, bitten halves of sand dollar shells, their star spines broken, remains of diapers bloated like some synthetic dead jellyfish, translucent slivers of shells shaped like livery dislocated thumbnails. One of the residents of the resort, Frank Nail, called these things giggles. Lots and lots of dead fish, tainted and cross-eyed in the noxious red tide fumes. There was also the plastic, gawky head of a knockoff Barbie doll. She stared back at me even more shocked and clueless than I felt, inviting some explanation. I don't know, Barbie. One minute, we were right there, almost living the American dream, married, mothering, if not exactly mortgaged or degreed. Then next, she stayed mum. The sea had washed off all her lipstick, and her lips looked parsed and sealed in her wide-eyed stare. Ragged hair burst from her bristly head in a tattered halo. She was like the period of an exclamation mark with the main stroke missing. Everybody good so far? Keep going. I put my dark brown toe, almost black in the sun, up to the base of her creamy chin to give her some body. I had no head for living, she had no feet for playing. Simpatico, as my ex-husband would have said. I muttered to her, why us? Why our lives? No clues, eh, girlie? Another wave rolled in, barely lapped at Barbie's shocking hair and then rolled away again. The sun flashed on something stuck to her head. I bent over and poked it, surprised when it poked back. I squished her cheeks between my thumb and index finger, leaving my pointer finger sticking up with a drop of blood oozing out of it. A rusty hook was jammed through the back of the doll's scalp. Well, that explains some things about your undoing, I suppose. The hook was a strange, multi-barbed affair, not the kinds you see in kids' storybooks or reruns of the Andy Griffin Show. I extracted it from her scalp carefully. Fortunately, the retirement resort required all staff members to get tetanus, flu, and a host of other vaccination pricks on a regular basis. I didn't worry about getting sick from yet another poke. But somehow, I still felt it best not to hurt Barbie too much more. Simpatico, after all. Maybe she was my white voodoo doll twin. After negotiating 3 of the 4 sickle ends of the hook free, it slid into my palm, and the bottom had less rest than the top. It made a shiny star shape from that angle. Sunlight winked against it, and time worked for me. A memory for the night of Saul's murder reeled in. A bent prong on our apartment gate glittered like a star in the streetlights as Officer Campbell patted my forearm. One of the first responding officers, Campbell was probably told to deal with me because she looked like me. Not really, but from some perspectives, probably closer than anyone else on the scene that night. She was black too, at least technically, in a pretty mocha frappuccino skin tone. I thought she was probably in her mid-20s, but she looked 12 that night in her oversized uniform and duty belt. The radio clipped to her shoulder took up her whole shoulder width. Her hair was neatly, tightly pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. My hair was shaved close to my scalp. I was older, wearier, with a cheating but devoted husband and a kitchen job. She still had hopes. My best hope was dead by the driving gate of our apartment block. Neither of us wore makeup, though, and her voice was not dainty. Is there someone I can call for you, Miss Astruez? A family member, a friend? My mind raced and circled like a murder of crows calling for everything and nothing at once. I was hungry and stupid for something, anything, to make sense for a second. Pedro didn't know yet. I didn't know where he was. With a woman? At a bar? Should I call my almost girlfriend, Letisa? I imagined her face pinched as she picked up her cell phone in her efficiency apartment by the interstate, afraid to answer because we never called one another. Only text and timid kisses behind dumpster fences. She wouldn't understand. I shook my head. Would you like me to call your husband? Campbell asked me as she stared back toward the scene. I don't know where Pedro is, I admitted. He doesn't have a cell phone. I had our only contracted cell phone since I was the only one with a full-time permanent job. When Pedro had a job, he bought a phone by the month. He wasn't working anything but his charm at that time. We didn't live in the best neighborhood, but it wasn't the worst either. Our apartment blocks were nestled in front of two neighborhoods backed against the suburban highway. Still good? Off the interstate. The fence around our apartments was in good shape. No rust. It was just this painted sea glass blue again a few months prior to that night. It gave the apartments a community feel for a while. I could have known some of my neighbors, but I didn't. We just waved as we passed in parking lots, too tired to exchange names. Still, I could see some of the neighbors I recognized standing in the parking lot, staring through our trusting fence with concerned faces. They were undecided in their concern, though. I knew, because I would have been thinking just like them. Is she okay? What happened? Did she do something? Are we in danger? That damn fence, it didn't keep us safe. It didn't keep us together, and it didn't keep danger out. I felt the first cold knife of my angry grief then. They'd painted that worthless fence a few months prior, but they hadn't bothered to fix the pedestrian gate. If some enterprising maintenance guy had just taken the damn defunct keypad off, no one would have had to worry about sneaking around the fence by following a car through the driver's gate. If only. The first rain of a billion if onlys thoughts trickled into a never-ending hurricane of onlys in my head that night. Back on the beach, Barbie's head gasped my grip and the memory receded. I shook my head. If only, I told her. At least you're unhooked now. I walked ahead and the hook up the beach to a trash barrel, and I put the hook in first, careful to push it through the top layer of plastic bottles and abandoned towels where it couldn't trouble her pretty little head anymore. I wedged her wounded head against the rim of the barrel, eyes skyward. The sand was so hot it burned even my hardened beach feet, so I headed for the cooling surf. The tide ebbed and pooled heavy against my ankles, dragging and sucking my feet underground. The more I sank into the sand, the more grounded I felt, closer to the underground, closer to Saul, buried in his white casket. Salt lay heavy in the air and pricked at my dry eyes. The last time I saw my son Saul alive washed over me again. We were standing in the middle of his bedroom, which is actually the living room of our small apartment. I was selfish. I didn't want him to go do his homework with his friends because that meant I would be sitting alone with nothing but bad network news to keep me company, while the sounds of other families laughing filtered past our thin walls. I wanted him to still need me as much as I needed him, but I knew those tables were turning. He was old enough. My head knew it, but my heart was another matter. His voice was deep, all manned out, but it still had a tiny edge of whining to it sometimes. Come on, Mama, Julie's house is right on the edge of Orange Grove, the very first house on the left as you turn in. He bugged his tea-brown eyes out at me and shook his head. I know, Saul. Julie is a good kid. We're really going to work on our project, I promise. Saul spread his large hands open in front of his thin body. I know Julie is a good kid, and you know I trust you. I didn't want to be alone, but I didn't want to admit that to him. He rubbed the palms of his hand over his tight brown curly hair. So what's the holdup? I watched him shift from one foot to another foot, one ratty Converse over the other as he waited for me to answer him. He was 16 years old. His shoulders were still as narrow as his hips, even if he did have to shave. My stomach grumbled. It's winter, Saul. It's Gainesville, Florida, Mama. Low of 62 degrees tonight. It gets dark before 6 o'clock now, Saul. There's a sidewalk the whole way. I only have to cross one street at a stoplight. He gave me a sideways smile and draped his long arm around my shoulders. I said nothing, but he could tell I didn't really have any reason against it. That kid could read me backwards in the dark. I'll be home by 7 for dinner. He kissed my cheek and grinned. His face smelled of his dad's favorite soap, some brand that hinted at Irish Spring for half the price. I liked the scent on both of them, but better on Saul. I shook my head and smiled back at him. A stray dog barked outside. I'll leave Julie's number on the fridge for you. He said Julie's name with a slight H sound on the front of it, a quirk that came from speaking Spanish with his father. He was a good kid, an honor student, like I had been at his age. He never sassed me. He never complained that we couldn't buy him a car or phone, or that his clothes came from the bargain boxes at secondhand shops. He smiled every day, and he did his best to make others smile too. He tried to take care of me in his own way. Those aspects were all things that I loved and underappreciated. I wasn't great at telling him, even when I had legitimate reason to do so, and I didn't have any particular reason to do so that night. So I just said okay. He promised to be home by 7 for dinner because we both knew his dad would wander in very late, drunk and smelling like some other woman. I didn't know when I heard the first siren for sure. It was 15 minutes after 7. I was smiling at the kitchen table with our food plated, and I got really worried. Saul was never more than a few minutes late to anything in his life. He was 2 days early for his own birth. He rolled out of bed every morning before his alarm clock even went off. The bottom just dropped out of my stomach as if I was on a plummeting airplane as I stared at the table. Instant mashed potatoes, canned green beans, and thin fried pork cutlets cooled on his plate. I thought I should call Julie to see what time Saul left her house, but when I got up from the table, my feet took me past my phone and through the front door. I ran across our blacktop parking lot in my socks toward the front gate of our apartment complex and the sound of sirens. A crowd of people were gathered around the gate, blocking my view. I remember tasting my heart in my mouth like a wad of dull zinc as I called out for Saul. I remember seeing one of his Converse on its side on the pavement, covered in so much blood that its washed-out gray canvas looked red all over. I pushed my way to the front, put my hands on the bars of the fence. 2 EMTs stood over him. 2 police cruisers blocked in a car behind him, and the fence separated me from them all. The pedestrian gate didn't work. I thought I was screaming for them to let me out, to let me through, but my voice was just an impotent mule in the milieu. I can keep going, or I can ask questions. What are you guys ready?
Is that the end of the first chapter?
No.
Does she find the shield in the first chapter?
Yes. It's a good question. But is there enough going on to keep you interested, even though we haven't gotten to the badge yet?
Yeah.
All right, we'll go from there. He's been dead 2.5 years, and his murderer had served a short parole and moved on to North Carolina by the time I stood there in the surf on Sanibel. I didn't blame the police, though. The whole community policing concept was in play in Gainesville, so there was always a black woman on patrol somewhere. And Officer Campbell was probably sent to mollify me because we looked alike, but she had known what I really needed. She pushed for information from me. She recorded the scene with her own cell phone camera. Her mentor, Sergeant Holland, nodded along with her efforts and stood flat-footed by the cruiser after loading the man who murdered my child, Reginald Hoover, into the back. Sergeant Holland was the crew-top, bull-necked, bulky boy you'd expect to encounter enforcing the law in Central Florida, but apparently current events had enlightened him enough to keep his mouth shut. He looked like the kind of guy who still lovingly referred to his ex-wife as that bitch and his alimony as having his balls in a vice grip. He gave that impression, but he never said a word to deter Officer Campbell from collecting extra statements. No, I didn't blame the police. They didn't kill Saul. They didn't fail to arrest his killer. I blamed the broader fucked up system. Reginald Hoover was a hater. He drove his car over Saul at the gate and then got out of his car and shot Saul in the chest with a .38 special for good measure because Saul was young and black. But in the great state of Florida, Reginald Hoover claimed self-defense under the Stand Your Ground law. There was no security camera on our pretty secure fence. Mr. Hoover was the only witness. He said Saul sassed him when he asked why my son couldn't make the pedestrian gate open if he really lived there. Saul sassed the 50-year-old 6-foot-tall Mr. Hoover so well that Mr. Hoover was afraid for his immediate safety. He warned Saul twice, once before he ran over him, and then again before he got out of his car and shot Saul on the ground. closer to gold, or that his ethnic similarity to Saul was limited to his maternal great-grandmother. It didn't matter that he didn't live in our apartment complex or even in one of the nearby neighborhoods. It didn't matter that Campbell found a box of neo-Nazi mailers in Mr. Hoover's back seat. Circumstantial evidence just didn't matter. Character witnesses didn't matter. Someone called in anonymously, only reporting that a pedestrian had been struck by a car. The police cruiser passing by on the highway was rerouted quickly to the scene, but just quick enough to keep Mr. Hoover from fleeing, not quick enough to see the subsequent shooting or what Saul did after being hit by the car. There were no actual witnesses to the event of my son's murder, other than Mr. Hoover. What did matter is that Reginald Hoover could afford a decent attorney, whereas the state didn't have many resources to spare for his prosecution. Only one oxytocin addled 67-year-old county prosecutor 2 months away from collecting his pension plan. The state arranged a negotiated plea deal, allowing Reginald Hoover to declare justified use of deadly force in defense, in return for pleading guilty to 3 misdemeanor weapons charges. I remembered many things while standing in the water that day in August, almost 3 years after Saul's murder, all of them hard. I couldn't remember what it felt like to be whole, though. I couldn't remember being innocent enough to believe that justice would eventually prevail. I couldn't remember what it was like to assume that the world would play fair if only I played fair too. I couldn't see a reason to risk loving anyone ever again. What was the point? Eventually, the sound of the ocean tide rolling over the shells like thousands of tiny dice clicking together brought me back to myself again. I hadn't realized how far I'd walked out into the surf. I tottered on the unsteady slope of a sandbar, and the hem of my gray basketball shorts got wet. Gritty waves tugged against the back of my knees. That's when it hit me. A sharp, wet slap on the side of one knee pulled past me on a wave, and then something limp and leathery caught between my legs. I reached down and plucked it from the water, black leather, well worn before it was worn more well by the ocean. It looked like a wallet, a broken clip on one side. I thought it was odd to have a money clip on the outside of a wallet at first. I flipped it open to find a wad of kelp wrapped around the gold shield. A bare edge of metal glinted in the sun. I pulled the kelp away from it, peered at the badge's dull enameling, proclaiming, Florida State Department of Law Enforcement. I rubbed away more kelp and the engravings became clear. Forensic Scientist 4242. The plastic ID sleeve was empty, gaping like an old dead squid. A shiver shot down my spine. The leather, dead skin, was waterlogged and gross. I wanted to drop it, but the enamel of the badge was warm. I'd never found anything like that before on this beach. It didn't seem right to stuff it in the trash barrel with Barbie. I traced the 4242 with the tip of my index finger. The grooves were soothing. I folded the wallet up and clutched it, dripping beside me as I walked home. The numbers and the title sang in my head with each step. I figured that forensic scientist would have just ordered a replacement badge, but I wasn't sure. It felt like a trophy, something someone might want back. Definitely something that shouldn't be left where any bastard could pick it up and use it to perpetrate a crime. Little did I know back then.